This episode is brought to you by the continuing education courses in the Neurodiversity University. From individual study at home access to a district-wide program for all your educators, the courses from Emily Kircher-Morris can be used to fulfill CE requirements. Go to neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes for more information.
We have this disconnect between this unmet need, not because the parents aren't trying or not, it's nobody's fault, but we end up with distress and dysregulation and disconnection because I haven't learned that mom, grandmom, dad, whoever it is, can soothe and meet my need.
Trauma impacts how we learn, connect, and see the world, especially for neurodivergent individuals. So what does it look like when trauma-informed practices support a neurodiversity-affirming approach? And what's the difference between being trauma-informed and trauma-responsive? Today, we're joined by Jessica Sinarski, author of Light Up the Learning Brain. We'll talk about the connection between trauma and neurodivergence. That's all coming up on episode 224. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
You've heard us talking about the Neurodiversity University Educator Hub, which is a place where educators can gather, learn, and support each other as they work to build neurodiversity-affirming schools. And now we have an upcoming opportunity for mental health clinicians who want to earn continuing education that focuses on neurodiversity-affirming practices. We're now an approved continuing education provider accredited by the National Board of Certified Counselors, and we're getting ready to launch our new community, the Neurodiversity University Therapist Hub. It'll offer monthly CEs for mental health counselors, and if this sounds like something that is up your alley, be sure to click on the link in the show notes and get on the list to find out when everything launches. Also, if you're interested in the Educator Hub, you'll find a link for that as well. Okay, Jessica Sinarski is here next.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
With kids, particularly where behavior is, bumpy, I'll call it that. I think there's so much parental energy and how do we control the kids' behavior when, of course, our goal is really how do we help them develop self-control. The challenge, of course, is it tends to be messy before it's less messy. What's interesting for me is the rage quitting or the anxious avoidance. I mean, all of these things are stress systems that are overwhelmed. And when I, as a parent, as a teacher, or administrator, whatever, go in and try to start controlling kids, by definition, I'm increasing their stress because I'm decreasing their healthy sense of control.
That's episode 206. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm talking to Jessica Sinarski. Jessica is a mental health counselor with a passion for integrating neuroscience into education and family life. She is the author of several books, including Light Up the Learning Brain. Jessica, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Emily.
So you've done a lot of work related to trauma and engaging trauma-informed practices to support young people, which is such important work. And when I think about being neurodiversity-affirming, I really believe that trauma-informed and neurodiversity-affirming practices are pretty closely aligned in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And, to be clear, neurodivergent people may have experienced traumatic events, but there's also the reality that being neurodivergent in spaces that aren't neurodiversity-affirming can also be traumatic in its own way. So I would love to hear your take on the intersectionality between trauma and neurodivergence.
Sure. So I think of our interaction with the world and what our brains are doing to make sense of the input that's coming in. And if you have experienced trauma, your brain has gotten really good at going into survival mode. For folks who are neurodivergent in a variety of different ways, that brain also sometimes gets very good at defense mode, at acting without thinking, at at being in survival mode when it's trying to survive in a world that really isn't built for it. And the way I think about that a fair bit is folks with trauma and folks with neurodivergence and some other folks too have spent time in the mistrust cycle, where instead of having a need, that need being met enough, good enough, enough of the time, right? Not perfectly, and being able to sort of build those connections in the brain toward problem solving, creativity, compassion, feeling safe and in control, like all of that kind of stuff. If you've had a need and tried to communicate your need the best you know how, and that need is not met or not met enough, then that leads to your brain going into that, what I think of as the downstairs brain survival state. And so a lot of folks with neurodivergent identities are experiencing that discord, that like, I don't know how to communicate my needs to you, and you don't know how to meet my needs, and you're judging me for having these needs or whatever it is. And so we end up with defense brains running the show, both from the individuals interacting with, you know, this student or this kid or whoever, as well as for that kiddo.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more about that trust or mistrust cycle, especially through that developmental lens from a really young age, and how that influences how we grow up and interact in the world.
So Dr. Nim Tottenham is a researcher out of Columbia, and she's the first person that I heard say this simple statement that now guides so much of what I do, and that is that all behavior comes from the brain. So I love learning about the brain because that's all this behavior that people end up getting really concerned about. Understandably, I get it. That is coming from the brain. And so as I started digging into neuroscience more, I think I was a little bit surprised, honestly, in hindsight. It might seem like it makes sense, but as I was digging into this, I was surprised at just how much those early life experiences of being able to trust that my needs will be met, how critical those are for building pathways in the brain and sort of laying down this infrastructure in the brain. So what happens in a really practical sense is, like if you think about a newborn baby, when they have a need, that need, like hunger, comes into their brain. You know, it's a series of chemical and electrical reactions going from their belly to their brain that says danger, danger, danger. And so their brain flips into protection mode, defense mode, right? And they need help from an adult with a well-connected brain, you know, an upstairs brain that's on to come and meet that need, to come and feed baby. And over time, that need being met over and over, again, not perfectly, good enough, close enough, with connection, all of those things, that starts to make it so like at 3 months, you might be able to bounce and rock and sing a song and give a binky and do all the things. And that baby might actually stop crying, like stop alarming about the need. They might have a little bit of upstairs brain power because that need has been met enough. They trust that it's coming. And that trust is actually building highways in the brain, which is just bonkers to me. And then at 6 months, you can kind of rock and bounce, or maybe even talk to them across the room. At 9 months, that's even more so. They might giggle with you, which is a sign that upstairs brain is on, all the way to where they start helping get the snack together, or they're able to wait, or to the extent that it would be a little weird if I burst into tears every time I was hungry, right? Not that I never burst into tears, but it's not every time.
But sometimes we're very hungry.
Exactly. Sometimes it is a very big danger signal, and I need that need met. When there are sensory processing challenges going on, and that hunger signal is sort of confused in the brain, maybe there's other stuff happening in the relationship dynamic. Maybe parent is distracted or dealing with their own stressors or their own sort of unresolved trauma. I mean, there's all kinds of intersectionality we could explore here. But when that baby either doesn't have the typical way of communicating the need, so maybe they don't cry out, or maybe they cry and cry and cry, and all the quote unquote typical soothing things, bouncing, rocking, squeezing, swaddle, binky, whatever, are not soothing to that little brain that is sending and receiving mixed messages. What starts to happen is, instead of moving from distress and dysregulation into the relief and relaxation that having that need met brings, we see that distress and dysregulation continue, right? When you think about colic or kids who seem like they're difficult to soothe or things like that, that we have this disconnect between this unmet need, not because the parents aren't trying or not, it's nobody's fault, but we end up with distress and dysregulation and disconnection because I haven't learned that mom, grandmom, dad, whoever it is, can soothe and meet my need. And it also has an impact on the adult brain. That's a whole nother rabbit trail we could go down. And it just makes it really, it's heartbreaking to me because what I would see in my private practice, what I would see in all of these different relationships was everyone trying the best they knew how. But when you've spent time in this mistrust cycle, it's harder to access some of those upstairs brain functions that will serve you better in the long run. And a lot of people get sort of shamed and blamed for the ways that they've learned to survive. And that's tragic too. So we just end up with dysregulation all over the place, which I think a lot of us are feeling pretty intensely at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to think about how that can start at such a young age. And the idea of overcoming trauma is a process that is not simple, nor does it happen very quickly. But if we have that relational piece, if we have that trust piece, that influences, how we experience that and recover and have, resilience.
Hey there, if you're an educator looking to create a more inclusive classroom, you should check out the courses at Neurodiversity University. The courses are all led by Emily Kircher-Morris, and they're packed with videos, handouts, and quizzes to help you better educate neurodivergent students, and students of all neurotypes, really. You can choose from a number of modules dealing with topics like learning how to support dyslexic students, nurturing gifted or twice exceptional kids, or helping autistic and ADHD learners thrive. There's even a course on using AI and fan communities to build coping strategies. These courses are great for professional development or to fulfill your continuing ed requirements. And parents, you can use them to better understand how teachers are accommodating your kids' needs and get some ideas to advocate from a stronger position. The university is part of the Neurodiversity Alliance, just like our podcast. So now you know, all that's left to do is head to the link in the description and check it all out. Let's make classrooms work better for every kind of learner.
What do you think we should consider as kids get older, or as we have people who are adults in our life who maybe are neurodivergent but have experienced this trauma? Like, how do we integrate that into helping build some of that resilience or healing from those experiences?
So I find it helpful to think about our downstairs brain, our survival brain in animal form. That's what I've infused into a lot of my writing. And so I think that allows for us to approach these hard to approach topics. I've worked with a lot of kids who have big rage episodes, or, we see these big extreme behaviors or completely shut down, sort of tucked in your turtle shell. And that is a vulnerable, protected part of you that is often hard to access. It's hard to grab that feelings word to talk about it. And so I find that having some animal metaphors helps us be able to approach these downstairs brain protective states so that we can honor that and learn some additional ways to move through the world, right? It gives us shared language. It lets us communicate about these really big and sometimes really off-putting behaviors in a way that is not shaming or pathologizing or any of those things. So even as kids are a little bit older, I find, and adults for that matter, we can talk about when we had a porcupine moment, or when my tiger brain got really loud, or, for me personally, my chameleon protector is the strongest. I think this is true for a lot of neurodivergent people who feel like they have to mask or who are in power differential situations, who have had to kind of go with what the norm is. I think, not that I want to get into the whole ABA conversation, but a lot of those kinds of things where, okay, I'll do the thing that you're asking me to do. I will blend in. I will be what you want me to be so that I can survive in this world. And then I think of that shutdown, all the way down into maybe having a hard time talking or communicating. I don't just mean verbal talking, but communicating. That shutdown, we can feel what it feels like to be in a turtle shell. You can feel how protective and curled in that is. And when we have this shared language around these 4 animals, that helps us be able to work through like, okay, when my turtle brain gets loud, this is what I need. And oh gosh, I'm reacting to that turtle moment in you by getting more tigery. And I want to ratchet up consequences, or I want to, if we're thinking about the workplace, well, drive this initiative more, instead of letting you have a moment to wrap your head around what's being asked or consume the information in a different way that works for you and move through. The more we get to know ourselves and the safer we make it for the whole community, whether it's workplace, school, family, whatever, to sort of embrace that whole brain, the upstairs brain that we want to see working a lot, but also that we all have downstairs brain moments that impact us and each other and find our way to work through together. It's not because you're bad. It's not because that person's wrong. We all have downstairs brain moments.
Yeah. And so what I really hear you saying here, though, is that in order to help build or maintain that trusting relationship, one of the tools we can use is to kind of externalize that and triangulate it like, this is not a characteristic or a quality that describes you inherently as a person. It's just kind of this reaction, and especially for younger people, like having this ability to say, oh, well, that's my chameleon brain, makes it a little bit safer to talk about. It makes it a little bit less personal.
Yeah.
And it also makes it easier then to, I think, connect with other people like, oh, I've been there too. I've experienced that.
Yes. Right. It's sort of activating compassion for yourself and how you naturally respond, as well as empathy. I love that you pulled that out because that's what I see happen. Oh, it makes sense that your porcupine brain got really strong. You got rejected by a lot of people, or whatever the thing is. Like, all behavior makes sense. And so when we can make it safe to approach ourselves and each other, we are ahead of the game. Mm-hmm. Kind of comes back to that trust, right? It's trusting myself, trusting the people around me. That becomes such a big factor in how we interact in the world.
Yeah. Trauma-informed has been such a buzzword in education and mental health spaces for a while now.
Yeah.
But I've heard some folks popping up and talking about the importance of being trauma responsive. What is the difference between the two that you see?
While I think language matters, I also see all kinds of these words and phrases get tossed around in ways that can feel almost shutting people down as opposed to empowering people. And so when I think of trauma-informed practice, I think the way I talk about it really pulls that trauma-responsive component in. So the definition that I like to work from is from Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey in their book, What Happened to You? They talk about trauma-informed practice being approaching people with the awareness that what happened to you is important. That's that trauma-informed, like I get that this matters, that it influences your behavior and your health. That's what we've learned from the adverse childhood experiences research. And then using that awareness to act accordingly and respond appropriately. So when I hear you say, like, what do you think about moving from trauma-informed to trauma-responsive, or how do those two things go together? I think trauma-informed gets tossed around like, oh, I went to this 30-minute webinar, now I'm trauma-informed. Or, gosh, I learned that adverse childhood experiences affect your nervous system, so now I'm trauma-informed. I think we're missing that, using that awareness to act accordingly and respond appropriately. that understanding ACEs is not the end of the story. Those positive childhood experiences are important. And so I hear from people, trauma sensitive or trauma responsive or trauma, lots of different phrases out there. I'm not as particular about what phrase you use. What I want to make sure is happening is that we are thinking about both components of that what happened to you is important, and using that to act accordingly and respond appropriately. I might even build on that to say, thinking about prevention, thinking about those positive childhood experiences that we know also act as a buffer. Again, if we go back to that trust versus mistrust, we know that the adults around the kids are the main component of what is impacting that brain development and whether or not there is trauma. And so positive adult experiences matter, and supporting all of the adults involved in kids' care, that's part of being trauma informed. So as with all of these buzzwords, self-care was the buzzword of the day. Like all of these things can have an element of real importance and things that we should be talking about, right? Self-care will cure all. Well, no, systems matter. And, that bubble bath is not going to cure the injustices of the world.
Absolutely. I know when I'm working with neurodivergent people in general, but especially neurodivergent young people, helping to identify their strengths. Like, what are the things that you're good at, and how can those influence your identity? How can those traits serve you, maybe in ways that you didn't even realize, or find ways to use them to help the areas that are more difficult.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you just have any ways that you have found that really work to help integrate that strengths-based approach for the clients that you serve.
I think one of the most powerful things is understanding that no part of the brain is bad. So how you are wired, your particular neurodivergent identity, or maybe, my brain does not make enough serotonin. So depression is a thing that is real for me. So I have some code blues that happen, and I know I need certain supports around that. That said, I'm also super creative, and the fact that my senses are sensitive serves me really well in lots of areas of life. And so I think for most of the people that I work with, it's a little bit of a relief to hear that no part of their brain is bad. It just might, different parts of their brain might just need a little extra support. I live in a home of neurodivergence. I am married to somebody with dyslexia and ADHD, and things were very different 40 years ago in how those things were approached. And so it's been such a challenging and intense in many ways, but also beautiful experience to be able to both see the things that his parents did amazingly well without having this knowledge of how to appreciate strengths, right? I really admire the way that my in-laws were able to celebrate his dynamic way of being and his intensity and all of those things that make him amazing. And, he had to learn some ways to deal with this, like to pay the bills or to do the things that are boring, or the things that the ADHD brain and the dyslexic brain around reading or whatever, that those things are a struggle. So now as we parent my son, we can hold this beautiful truth that, there are these certain going with the flow things and learning to read and doing the boring stuff that are really, really hard for you. And you are dynamic and amazing. And the way that your brain can manipulate and move things through space is so different than how mine can. That's so cool, right? We can hold both truths, not minimizing the challenges, but not missing those beautiful strengths that are there with the impulsivity, with the, whatever it is for that person.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think so much of it is kind of normalizing the experience and just talking about it. And celebrating the things that are good, but also, I like that both and approach. It doesn't have to be either all good or all bad. It can be both.
Yeah. There's a young man in my church community who is autistic and doesn't have a lot of verbal communication, but has some sort of, will kind of shout out some things sometimes and has some enthusiasms, as I have heard the autistic community talk about. And I think there would have been a time, I know there would have been a time in my life where I felt uncomfortable or awkward or like not sure how to deal with it. And I think listening to the neurodivergent community and learning from folks who've been in this work for a very long time, I have found that I feel this joy. Like when he sort of shouts out when something, someone's preaching or there's something else happening, and I hear this enthusiasm.
Yeah,
that's really how I think of it. It brings me joy, and I think that's the strengths-based side of things. It doesn't minimize some of the challenges his mom has had as they're figuring out how to do life together and all of those things, or the challenges that he has had figuring out how to do life in this world not meant for him, not designed to really understand him. It's both and. We don't have to ignore all of that. We can hold that and share the joy, delight in my son's explorer brain that goes off on a million tangents. Yes, it's frustrating when it's time to brush your teeth. And it's really a beautiful thing, and I'm sure will serve him well in lots of ways.
When you're working with schools, what are the things that you see as the next steps that are either beginning to be implemented or maybe are on the horizon as far as creating a school that blends that neurodiversity-affirming piece as well as the trauma-informed and trauma-responsive piece? Like, where's that headed, or where do you hope that it's heading?
I really hope it's headed in a direction that is that both and that we were just talking about. I think I've seen things swing wildly from one extreme to another where, being quote unquote trauma informed means we're letting kids destroy classrooms because we don't want to insult their dignity by setting a boundary. Whoa, like that's not good for anyone, right? What are we doing with the trust between that teacher and student when that happens? And no one feels good after they've destroyed stuff. Like that doesn't feel good. So my hope is we can hold this strengths-based perspective that no part of the brain is bad, while also looking at all behavior making sense on some level. So getting out of this sort of punish bad behavior mindset and think about becoming brain builders. I don't want teachers to be parents and counselors and private practice therapists. That's not your job. Your job is to teach. And when we understand how brains work, teaching becomes so much easier because you're actually doing the things that are going to let you access the part of the brain that you're trying to access. The other thing I think is worth mentioning in that intersection of neurodiversity and trauma in the school setting is I think it is critical that our schools understand the hidden senses more than is the current norm. I think that's true for mental health counselors too, for that matter. Like lots of mental health and social workers don't understand the hidden senses, but that I believe is critical for working from a brain-body based perspective.
Absolutely. Jessica, this has been such a great conversation. This does bring me to my closing question. So if you were talking with an adult who is supporting a neurodivergent young person, and that young person has had their trust broken, what is it that you would share with that adult? Like, what next step would you suggest that they take?
Ooh, that's a big question. I think the first thing that I am immediately drawn to is being curious. Like, to let that spark curiosity in you, because curiosity can activate our upstairs brain, our ability to think things through and choose connection, even when it's easier, even when that default mode would be to disconnect and feel mad or punish or walk away. So I think that next step would be to be curious, both with that kid, but also with the resources available to help understand what might be going on with that kiddo. This is tricky because there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of people who say, say this one phrase and it works every time. And so if you hear that, if this one phrase is going to work every time, that might not be your most trustworthy source of information, because brains are unique. We are all wired quite differently. There's certainly overlap. There are themes, there are systems that we all have. And being curious about how that kid is wired, why they respond in the ways that they do, and what the need is to support both skill building or sensory inputs or things that will help them dial back some of those defense brain responses, as well as what are those in the moment things that, hey, when my tiger brain is really loud, I know I need this. Those kinds of conversations, I think, are critical for all of us, but especially for any brain that maybe is a little bit more wired for protection than that connection mode.
Jessica Sinarski, author of Light Up the Learning Brain. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Trauma isn't always caused by one major occurrence, like a catastrophic event. The daily wearing down of feeling unsafe in an environment that is unpredictable can lead to complex trauma with some of the same trauma outcomes: hypervigilance, intense reactions to perceived threats, and protective actions to avoid any possible exposure to similar events. When unnoticed or unsupported, these things hold us back. And when neurodivergent people don't have a space where they can retreat and feel safe, they never know what that can look like. Creating neurodiversity-affirming spaces is the best way we can proactively avoid putting neurodivergent people in these situations. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Our thanks again to Jennifer Sinarski. We have links to more information about her and her work in the show notes. Also check the notes for links to get more information about our growing Educator Hub and our upcoming Therapist Hub. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.